I hope so.
Yay!
It's using the wrong camera. Hello. I'll try to switch it to my better camera. There we go.
Oh, looks good enough.
The skeleton for a camera. Um, okay,
Whoa,
so
fancy.
fancy.
It's a
Find
capital.
my. So I think I worked out the share screen trouble we were having before. So this
It's
should look like a
it's
normal
buffering.
PowerPoint
Yes,
slide.
yes,
Yes,
it
it's
works.
working.
Perfect.
Uh,
Yeah. Okay. Whenever you guys are ready, I can get started.
yeah, yeah. We are pretty good on time. You have the stage.
Okay. Perfect. I'm gonna reset my timer. Alrighty. So thank you all for being here. My name is Amelia Zietlow. I'm a PhD candidate at the American Museum of Natural History, and today I'll be talking to y'all about the animals that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Did the slide advance?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, great. That was a technical issue we were having earlier. So anyway, as long as people have been living alongside bodies of water, we've been telling stories about the kinds of sea monsters that have been living, or that may have been living in the depths. Typically, these stories converge upon a dragon-like sea serpent appearance. These animals make appearances in all kinds of media, including music, movies, TV shows, anything and everything you can think of in the modern day, as well as, of course, in the past. Um, and obviously, sea serpents like this are not actually real animals, but the animals that I believe approach this body form the closest are the mosasaurs. The name-bearing animal and the one that's in the Jurassic World movies is Mosasaurus hoffmanni. So that was the first one that was found and described. I'll get a little bit more into that later. But first, we're going to back up quite a bit in time and talk more about where these things actually came from, cover a bit of basics about what they are, and what makes them special. So, Mosasauroidea is the formal name of the whole group. They lived in the late Cretaceous from about 100 to 66 million years ago. So, all things considered, they were only around for a blink of an eye geologically. In that time, they managed to basically take over the world's oceans and waterways. They have a global distribution. Their fossils have been found on literally every continent, including Antarctica. And they have been found in both fresh and salt water, primarily salt water, but there's a couple freshwater ones. One in particular. They were completely aquatic, meaning that they did not have to crawl up on land for anything. That includes giving birth. So unlike a sea turtle, which has to lay its eggs up on land, these guys were actually giving live birth in the water. And they are the largest known squamates, or snakes and lizards, that has ever lived, with some individuals pushing 50 feet long, so 14 meters, give or take. They are basically the only thing we can agree on these things phylogenetically is that they are not related to dinosaurs, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, any other marine reptile you can think of, that they are, in fact, lizards. Within lizards, they fall within Toxicophora. To back up a slight amount here, just in case you're not familiar with how to read these diagrams, this is an evolutionary tree or phylogeny. Basically, how they work is you're moving from bigger, more general groups to smaller, more specific groups, and these groups are tied together by things that they share through common ancestry. So mosasaurs are within squamates, and then within that, they are amongst the toxicophorans, which include today's iguanas, snakes, and monitor lizards. You may be aware that there's a bit of a debate about where mosasaurs fall within the squamate tree of life. For the purposes of this talk, I am proceeding with the hypothesis that they are more closely related to varanid lizards or the monitors, but I do want to be really clear that this is still not a solved question. And the other hypothesis is that they are sister to snakes. So there's two camps in mosasaur research. I tend to lean towards varanids, but I do want to be crystal clear that this is not something we know for sure. What we do know for sure is that they have a ridiculous range of body sizes. So the earliest mosasauroids, things like Aegialosaurus and Dallosaurus, are teeny tiny by mosasaur standards, 3 to 4 feet long. So I've got these guys next to a Tyrannosaur and a Komodo dragon, which is the largest non-snake lizard that is alive today. And even the Aegialosaurs, like I call them small, but they're big lizards. Like lizards today, we think about, geckos and things like that tend to be under a foot long. Aegialosaurs are like iguana-sized, which is a large lizard. However, they got, of course, even bigger. The smaller end of the size range are things like Cladastes, somewhere between 10 and 20 feet long, so 3 and 10 meters, give or take. I guess this is more of a 10-meter range thing. This is a Platysaurus, and then of course we've got the true sea monsters, the Mosasaurus and Tylosaurus, which grow to be between 12-15 meters long. Within mosasaurs, there's a huge amount of diversity, morphologically or in their anatomy. The most obvious point of diversity is in their teeth. So these guys were basically eating anything and everything that moved. The only thing they didn't seem to do was filter feed. God forbid we ever find a filter feeding mosasaur. I would not be happy about that, but it would be cool. So we've got weirdos like a Xenodens over here that has like bandsaw teeth, basically. Kind of your standard railroad spikes in the middle, and Globidens on the left, which is the big bubble-like crushing teeth for smashing open ammonites. One of my critiques of Prehistoric Planet's depiction of this animal is that if a Globidens bit into that ammonite, it would shatter into 1,000 pieces. There's no way they were not exploding these guys. So, speaking of a lack of morals or respect for other living things, we're going to focus in on Prognathodon. This is a kind of mosasaur that I kind of lumped into the railroad spike tooth category. What I didn't mention is that, unlike Tylosaurus and other normal, quote-unquote, toothed mosasaurs, Prognathodon has teeth that are extremely thick. They've got, like, a coarse texture to them, and they're serrated on both sides. And they were using those teeth to tear into other marine reptiles, including other mosasaurs. This is a Prognathodon that was published a couple weeks ago. I think it had been published prior. But anyways, it's got gut contents that preserve not one, not two, but three other mosasaurs. Just the skulls. Don't know why, but, so these guys probably were specializing on other marine reptiles, so turtles, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and that's consistent with what we find. Mosasaurs also like to fight with each other quite a bit. This is probably the best example that's published of this. This is a Tylosaurus that is just loaded in bite marks. That probably killed it. These holes on the top of the head go straight through the bone into the brain case. And, this isn't entirely surprising given the behavior of modern giant lizards, which, I wouldn't say they're incapable of getting along, because they certainly can, but they do like to bite each other, and they do especially like to bite each other on the head. So now, to zoom in a bit and talk about what a mosasaur actually is, because like I said, there's these tiny little leggy guys called Allosaurs. I've got this tree here, which shows all the different flavors, and we're going to kind of break this down into the different kinds shown in here. However, I will not be talking very much about halosaurians, because they jump around this tree constantly. It's really hard to understand where they go, because they're very weird, so know that they are a separate group, but they're probably their own thing, but for this talk, I'm not going to focus too much on them. So, we're going to focus in on the true mosasaurs, so to speak. Like I said earlier, they evolved about 100 million years ago. The world was a very different place, very, very damp. There's a lot more. The sea levels were much higher. And so these guys, the Allosaurs, are considered mosasauroids, but not mosasaurids. So they're within that group, but they're just kind of a little bit outside the main group of big flippery monsters. There's two really good fossils of these guys. Allosaurus, this is held in Munich, and Opediosaurus, which is in Vienna. Both of these guys are from Croatia. Both of them are about 100 to 95 million years old. And they're both relatively small for a mosasaur, mosasauroid. These things were probably semi-aquatic, so they were probably spending a little bit of time on land still. We know that based on the anatomy of their limbs. So we've got a forelimb here that still looks very much like a Varanus, or just a standard lizard forelimb. As well as, more importantly, the hips are still attached. There's still a bony attachment of the hips to the spine. They still have sacral vertebrae. The true mosasaurs, on the other hand, the mosasaurids, don't do that. We've got a forelimb anatomy that's much more similar to other flippered animals like whales and plesiosaurs. And they just decide that, hey, we're not going to fuse our pelvic bones anymore. Not to each other, not to the spine. They're just going to be nice and loose. And that's part of the reason we know these things were giving live birth. If you have hips that are not attached to your spine, you cannot support your weight on land. So it's physically impossible for these things to be crawling up and laying eggs. Because they're reptiles, reptile eggs must be laid on land because they need to breathe air still. They're not like fish eggs or frog eggs with that kind of jelly coating that allows them to function like a gill, basically. And on top of that, in case we needed more evidence, there is more evidence. There's an Ankylosaur called Carsosaurus that actually has little babies preserved inside of it. So to return to this question for the purposes of how I conceptualize these and for this talk, the true mosasaurs are these guys, the mosasaurid. So everybody at that point upwards. And there's a lot of diversity up there, which raises the question, how many times did these things actually evolve? Was it as simple as the leggy terrestrial ancestor turned into an Ankylosaur-ish thing, which then became kind of a proto-mosasaur, and the proto-mosasaur then diversified into all these things that we see. So again, ignoring halosaurines, there's two big groups of mosasaurs, and within one of them, there's two more groups. These are the Platypletycarpians and the Tylosaurians, and those fall within the Russellosaurians, and on the other side, you got the Mosasaurians. A real quick and dirty way to tell these guys apart is to look at the snout. Tylosaurians have a big honking rostrum at the end, so that's like an extension of bone that doesn't have any teeth on it. Platypletycarpians have no rostrum, the teeth go all the way up to the end of the bone, and Mosasaurians tend to have this little pointy snoot. Another way to tell them apart is in how rubbery their legs are. So Mosasaurians ossify all of their carpals and tarsals, their wrist and ankle bones. Ossify is when cartilage turns to bone. Platypletycarpians have kind of an intermediate amount of ossification, and then Tylosaurs are like literally made of rubber. They usually ossify one of them. So those structures are still in their wrists. They're just made of cartilage instead of bone, which is why I say they're made of rubber. So we can really think about this in terms of this diversity of limbs. So how many times did flippers evolve in these guys? Because each of the groups does have a very different structure of flipper. And even within the mosasaurines, we've got a ton of variation in terms of finger length and ossification and that kind of stuff. And this is, again, not really surprising given that they're squamates or lizards, because lizards love to do crazy things with their legs, and by crazy stuff, I mean they usually like to lose them. So every picture on here represents an independent loss of legs in squamates. Like, snakes are the most popular one, the one most people know about, but there are really tons of different kinds of legless lizards. And while mosasaurs, again, haven't lost their legs, they certainly have tampered with them. Like, this is an abomination, basically. This is the Platosaurus flipper, and they basically became the closest to what ichthyosaurs and other marine reptiles have achieved in terms of really blocking out their flippers into this hard surface. But again, among the different kinds of mosasaurs, we've got a ton of variation within just the mosasaurines, and then, of course, differences between those guys and the other major groups. And so what's fun about this, I'm saying fun sarcastically, is that there is this possibility, but there's also this possibility that these things actually, the true mosasaurs, the mosasaurids, converged upon the mosasaur body plan independently of one another. The bottom line is right now we're not entirely sure how many times they did this, but we do know it wasn't one. It seems to be at least 3 times. So this is where halosaurians come in that they're kind of weird, and I wish we had more of them, because the answer might actually be 4, which is just absolutely wild. We know that it's at least 3 times because we actually have these fossils. We have leggy little Platypletycarpian and a leggy little mosasaurine. And if we plot those guys out on the tree of mosasaur evolution, we can see that each of these groups had to have come from a little leggy ancestor. So even though we currently do not have a leggy Tylosaur ancestor, the fact that we have a leggy thing that is absolutely a Platypletycarpian means that a leggy Tylosaur must have existed at some point, which I think is pretty cool. So now to zoom in back to the mosasaurine. So you might have guessed this. This is the group that Mosasaurus belongs to. They are extremely diverse in body size, flipper anatomy, and tooth shape. So in terms of body size and flipper shape, Dallosaurus is the name of the little leggy guy that was kind of the first thing that keyed us into, oh, wait a minute, there might be some convergent evolution going on in these guys. It's from the Turonian about 90 million years ago. And it's part of the reason that mosasaurians have such a wide diversity in body size. It's the tiny little guy over here. And so, again, when I showed this slide earlier, these are all mosasaurians. In skull shape as well, they They really do everything. Kind of incredible. They realize, of course, that Tylosaurus is the best body plan, and they've got one that kind of mimics that and starts to grow a little rostrum on its own. And then we've also got the abomination Platysaurus, which is effectively becoming an ichthyosaur. So Mosasaurus itself was around at the very end of the Maastrichtian, about 67 million years ago. They are ridiculously big. So the jaw that I'm holding there is actually A, not the entire jaw, it's only the first 2/3 of the jaw. B, it's not the biggest one I've seen. These guys are literally found around the world. I'll get back to that in a minute. But to give a little background on the history, these guys were discovered in the 1700s in Maastricht. The first one was found in the 1760s, later another one in the 1780s, and this is very shortly after Reptilia was named, which I thought was pretty interesting. And Mosasaurus itself was actually named about 20 years before Dinosauria was named, which I think is pretty interesting. The holotype is in Paris currently on display. You can go see it there. We've got this guy that's the jaw I was holding. It's on display in New Jersey. And then the Tyrrell also has a couple cool Mosasaurus specimens. So yeah, like I said, these guys were literally to foreshadow a bit here, world serpents, in that they have been found in Europe and North America, in Africa and South America, and possibly also Antarctica. So these guys were really taking over the Atlantic Ocean, basically. And that brings us to our world serpent, Jormungandr. This guy was published in October this year. It's found near Walhalla, North Dakota, and it's about 80 million years old, so about 15 million years before Mosasaurus huffmani. The specimen includes basically a complete skull. We're just missing the brain case, complete jaws, and the first couple of vertebrae. This is what the guy looks like, all put back together. And then we have this wonderful line drawing that Henry did for us to show a little bit better what he would look like if he were not, mushed up and beat up. The vertebrae have these horrible bite marks on the underside, which means that either this holotype specimen was scavenged or was killed, because there's no other way to get a tooth into the underside of the cervical vertebrae. Sorry, the cat's throwing up behind me. I'll deal with that later. Anyway, so Yorgi, to talk a bit about, to bring this back to the topic of the title of this, where Mosasaurus came from, the answer is something very much like Jormungandr, and to give a bit of background on why I have pitched it as that way and have described him as that way. I've given just a little overview of Mosasaur systematics, and this is a bit of hyperspace, so don't worry if this is a lot. But basically, Mosasaur relationships have been studied using effectively the same data set for the past 30 years. The data set has been changed and updated a little bit, so one group changed the outgroup, so basically the point of reference that we use to study the Mosasaur relationships. Another group kind of reassessed and fixed some problematic characters, but notably there has not been a significant increase in the number of characters added to this data set, so the characters are basically the variation that we're describing, that's telling us how these things are related. And so there's a lot of bones that are just completely missing from this data set. For example, the femur, I think, has like one character, and that's, the thigh bone. So that's pretty important. And there's also not been much use of new methods for discovering characters like CT scans and things. It's also missing a lot of new taxa and a lot of non-North American taxa. And the historical reason for this is the first matrix was built using Russell 1967, which is a book basically describing North American mosasaurs. It's a really good reference. I highly recommend it if you're interested in learning mosasaur anatomy and stuff. But that one was deliberately focused on basically the collections of the Yale Peabody Museum and the American Museum of Natural History. So it's very biased for the, seaway species, Cladastes, Tylosaurus, Platycarpus. And this is not accounting for a lot of the European species, so things like Mosasaurus lemonieri and Carinodens, as well as any of the new Moroccan taxa or other species from other parts of the world. And then lastly, sometimes like the characters themselves, so the name of the data point that we're studying has been edited. but the actual scores or the information that we have for them in here has not. So like this bone, for example, like there was something describing the underside of it, and it's just like, okay, no one's flipped it over in 100 years. Come on. How Yorgi fits into this is that it possesses this unique combination of characters that are not really accounted for in this matrix, which is why, as I'll get to in a minute, we got kind of a weird position for it. We know this thing is a new species because it has a unique combination of anatomy not seen elsewhere. The one that I'll talk about is the frontal, and this is also how it fits into the story of where Mosasaurus came from. The frontal is kind of the forehead bone. This is looking at it upside down. So the eyeball is kind of like in here. To show the anatomy here, there's some other bones that kind of touch the frontal underneath it. In Cladastes, these bones are separated by a wide gap. In Yorgi, there's only a little gap, and in Mosasaurus, the gap is completely gone. So just showing this kind of progression of getting from something like Cladastes to something like Mosasaurus. So before Yorgi, this is what the Mosasaurine tree looks like. You can see Cladastes is kind of down here. We got Progmathodon, and then up here, Mosasaurus and Platysaurus kind of doing their own thing. This is what the actual tree looks like for Yorgi, and you might notice that he's kind of nested in here with Cladastes. However, what this is showing is not that it's another species of Cladastes. This actual, like, this comb shape here where there's no, like, tiering or structuring is called a polytomy. And what that means is that the computer, in analyzing the data, has not been able to figure out how those things relate to each other. But on top of that, you have to remember all the issues that I talked about before, where a lot of the anatomy of these animals is not actually accounted for in the data set that's used to produce this. And so that's what this... that's basically what my research here at the AMNH has been on, is fixing this problem, because we know where this guy goes based on its anatomy. But because that anatomy is not accounted for in the data set, it's impossible for the computer to find that relationship. So this is what we actually believe is going on, is that Jormungandr represents this transitional form in between the early Cladastes, small-bodied, slender-faced guys, and the horrible sea monsters. And so, yeah, it's just illustrating. So he's filling in this gap between smaller mosasaurines and the larger, like, Mosasaurus proper. And again, so highlighting that our understanding of mosasaur relationships might not be entirely correct, which overall influences our understanding of lizard evolution, and fits into this broader picture of how many times did mosasaurs evolve, but even beyond that, this has further implications for how this informs our understanding of whether these things are more related to snakes or to other kinds of lizards. So, overall conclusion, it's really important to be aware of of why your data is the way it is, and kind of have a bigger understanding of why the results are what they are, what kind of factors could be influencing what you're getting from the the algorithms and things. And yeah, as I said, there might be a bit more going on here within mosasaurs themselves if this is a fundamental misunderstanding of a major group of animals that's been studied for 200 years, and yet, there's still more to learn about them. So to kind of summarize, like, why mosasaurs are cool and I love them in particular. First of all, there's lots of fossils, which means that we can do some statistics on these guys. A lot of vertebrate fossils, fish excluded, and some mammals have really low sample sizes. That's not the case for mosasaurs. I've personally seen over 350 of these things, and I know that there's about 4,400 of them in North America alone. They have really close living relatives, which means that we can actually have a better understanding on intraspecific variation, things like sex and ontogeny, because we can study those things in living animals that are objectively not that different, and we can actually do, embryological experiments and things. And then last of all, they're charismatic, which basically means they're really cool and fun to talk about, and they get people excited about paleontology and evolution, and hopefully lizards, but more than that. All right, so I'm only about 4 minutes over, which is not that bad, given that there were 60 slides here, but thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, of course, to Josh for inviting me and organizing this. And I'd be more than happy to take questions if we have time. If not, I will lurk in the Q&A channel.